There's a conversation you haven't had. You know exactly which one. You've probably known for longer than you care to admit. It might be with a member of your team. It might be about something in the business that's been quietly getting worse. It might even be a conversation with yourself that you've been successfully avoiding for months. And every day that conversation doesn't happen, something is getting a little heavier, a little more complicated, a little more removed from the moment when it would have been simple. What it actually is, why it feels like the safest choice, and what it quietly costs you and the people around you when you keep choosing it. Welcome to the Lead World channel, where we explore the inner world of leadership, well-being, and what it means to build a business and a life that doesn't break you. My name's Trevor. I've run a multi-award-winning restaurant and cocktail bar, but I didn't come from a hospitality background. I built that business from the ground on up, learning as I went, figuring it out in real time. And one of the things I've learned the hard way is that the things that we don't say are not neutral. They accumulate, they take up space, they shape the culture of the team and the interior life of the person responsible for leading it in ways that are real and significant and entirely invisible until they're not. And I want to talk about that today because I think it's one of the most common and least acknowledged patterns in hospitality leadership. And I've lived enough of it to have something worth saying about it. Let me start with saying something that might be a little bit uncomfortable. Most hospitality leaders that I've worked with, myself included for a long time, are carrying at least one conversation that they haven't had. Often more than one, and the longer they carry it, the more reasons they find for why now isn't quite the right time. And I want to be careful here about how I characterize this, because I think the way we usually talk about it does people a disservice. We frame it as conflict avoidance, as weakness, as a failure of leadership nerve, and I don't think that's what it is in most cases. In most cases, it's something much more recognizable than that. It's care. It's a genuine reluctance to cause harm, and you don't want to damage a relationship that matters to you. You don't want to make a situation worse. You're not certain that you're being entirely fair. You're exhausted, and the emotional reserves required for a difficult exchange that might not go cleanly don't feel available right now. Those aren't failures of character. They're human responses, and they're worth naming as such before we talk about what they cost. Because they do cost, even when the intention behind the avoidance is kind. Here's what I used to do, and I say used to, but honestly it's still something I have to watch for myself time to time. I'll see something in the business that needed addressing, a standard that was slipping, a dynamic in the team that was creating friction, a conversation with a member of staff that was overdue, and I'd make a calculation, usually very quickly and very quietly, that it would sort itself out, that the timing wasn't right, that the relationship was too important to risk, that I'd find a better moment down the line. And what I was actually doing was choosing my own comfort over the clarity the situation needed. And I dressed it up as consideration because that felt more acceptable than calling it what it was. The timing that was never quite right, the moment that kept not arriving, the situation that didn't sort itself out but instead got slower and heavier and more complicated until the conversation that would have been straightforward 6 weeks ago became genuinely difficult. There's a particular version of this that I think is especially common in owner-operated hospitality businesses where the relationship between a leader and their team isn't purely professional, where you've been through things together, where the person you need to address something with has been a part of the story for years, where saying a thing almost feels like a betrayal of a shared history. And so you don't say it, you absorb it instead. You manage around it, you compensate, and you hope that over time the situation changes without you having to be the one that changes it. It almost never works out that way. This is the part I think deserves the most attention because I don't think we're honest enough in this industry about what the silence actually does. Not just to the situation, but to the team and to the leader carrying it. When something goes unaddressed, a vacuum forms, and teams are very good at filling vacuums. Not with the truth of what's happening because they don't always have access to that, but with their own interpretation of it, and the interpretation is usually less charitable than the reality. If a leader doesn't address something, the team doesn't conclude that the leader hasn't noticed, they conclude that the leader has noticed or doesn't care enough to say anything, or that the standard doesn't actually matter, or that the behavior that should have been addressed is in fact acceptable. Standards drift that way, not through dynamic decisions, through the accumulated weight of what doesn't get said. And then the leader finds themselves carrying not just the original situation, but the consequences of it having gone unaddressed. the erosion of standards, the team's changed relationship to accountability, the gap between what the business should look like and what it actually looks like, which was widened quietly while the leader was waiting for the right moment. What it does to the leader carrying it is just as significant. There's a particular kind of weight that comes from knowing something needs to happen and not making it happen. It doesn't leave you alone, it runs in the background. It surfaces at inconvenient moments. It contributes to the low-level tension that's become so familiar. It stops registering. It contributes to the low-level tension that becomes so familiar, it stops registering as tension and just feels like the ordinary texture of the job. I had a period of several months where I was carrying a handful of those unaddressed things simultaneously. Not enormous things individually, but together they created a background noise in my leadership that I couldn't seem to get quiet. And what I noticed when I finally worked through them one by one was that how much each space they'd been taking up, space that immediately became available for something else once the conversation had happened. Before I go on, I just want to take a moment to mention my Lead Well community. It's a free community for hospitality leaders and founders where we have exactly these kind of conversations, the ones this industry doesn't usually make space for. If you're finding any of this resonant and you want to be around people who understand the specific pressures of running a venue, come and find us. The link's in the description. It's completely free. Let's get back to the video. What saying it out loud actually does. There's something that happens when you finally say the thing you've been not saying, and I want to try and describe it as precisely as I can because I think it's the most useful thing in this video. The thing in your head doesn't have edges. It exists in the space between your thoughts, expanding and contracting, sometimes enormous and sometimes almost manageable, but it's always there. It takes on the shape of whatever you're most afraid of. It carries every possible version of how the conversation could go wrong. It accumulates association over time until what started as a fairly contained issue has become freighted with everything that you've been thinking and worrying about since you first decided to address it. When you say it out loud, it becomes a real and bounded thing. It has specific shape. It takes a specific amount of time to say, it can be responded to, it can change shape in response to what the other person says. It can be resolved, or at least moved, in ways that the version living only in your head can't be. Almost every time I finally had this conversation I've been avoiding, my first response after it was to wonder why I'd waited for so long. Not because it was easy, sometimes it wasn't, but because the thing I'd been carrying for weeks or months had taken about 15 minutes to say, and the person that I said it to had responded in a way that I hadn't anticipated, and the relief was immediate and disproportionate to the difficulty of the conversation itself. That ratio, the enormous weight of the carrying versus the relatively modest difficulty of the saying, is something that you can only really understand experientially. No amount of being told that the conversation won't be as bad as you think actually prepares you for the experience of it being less bad than you thought. You have to feel it for yourself. And once you do, once you have that reference point, the next avoided conversation becomes a little less avoidable. What a grounded leader actually sounds like. I want to spend some time on this because I think there's a version of directness in leadership that gets talked about in a way that puts people off rather than drawing them towards it. The idea that being a clear leader means being blunt, delivering hard truths with maximum efficiency and minimum emotion. That kind of thing. That's not what I mean by direct with clarity, and it's not what I found to be true with the leaders who communicate well. What I've noticed, both in my own development and in the leaders that I admire, is that the clearest communicators are often the calmest. Not calm in a detached or distant way, calm in the sense of being grounded in what they want to say before they say it. Not reactive, not saying the thing in the heat of the moment and then managing the fallout. Taking the time to know what they actually think and feel and want to communicate, and then doing it from that settled place. There's a practice I've developed, imperfect and still ongoing, of giving myself space before I respond to things that feel loaded. Not always possible in the middle of a service, but as a general orientation, choosing not to say the first thing that arrives in your brain. Sitting with what I actually want to communicate rather than what I want to express in the moment. That space, even a few seconds of it, changes the quality of what comes out. It means the thing you say is actually what you mean rather than what you feel in that instant. And it means that a person receiving it gets the clearest version of you rather than the most reactive one. Direct with clarity isn't about saying more, it's about saying the right thing from the right place. And the right place is usually somewhere quieter and more considered than the moment of the highest emotion. How to actually start. So if you're sitting with a conversation that you've been avoiding, here's what I'd actually suggest. Not a script, not a framework with 5 steps, 3 things that have helped me. The first is being clear with yourself about what you actually want to say before you say it. This sounds obvious. It's remarkable how often it doesn't happen. We go into difficult conversations with a general sense of what's wrong and an expectation that the words will just arrive when we need them. Sometimes they do, often they don't. And what comes out instead is an imprecise version of what we meant that the other person hears differently to how we intended it. And then we're in a different conversation to the one that we needed to have. Spend 10 minutes beforehand being specific. What is the actual thing that I'm addressing? What do I want the outcome of this conversation to be? What am I prepared to hear in response? That preparation changes the quality of what follows considerably. The second is leading with the impact rather than the judgment. What the situation is doing rather than what it says about the person. Not a character assessment, a description of consequence. This requires you to have done the first thing properly, to know clearly what you're addressing and why. But when you can describe the impact of something without it becoming an indication of the person, conversations tend to stay open rather than becoming defensive. The third is giving the other person room to respond, not delivering a verdict and waiting for a reaction, saying what you need to say and then being genuinely interested in what comes back. Sometimes what comes back is information that you didn't have. Sometimes it changes how you see the situation. Sometimes it doesn't change anything, but the person feels heard in a way that makes what follows easier. And these aren't guarantees. Some difficult conversations are difficult regardless of how well you prepare for them. But the ones that go badly because you went in clear and grounded and direct are much rarer than the ones that go badly because you went in reactive or unprepared or so long overdue that the weight of the delay became part of the dynamic. The conversation with yourself. I want to end with something that I think underlies all of this. The most significant avoided conversation for most leaders isn't with a member of their team, it's with themselves. The honest internal conversation about whether they're showing up in a way that they want to, whether the standards they hold other people to are the standards they hold themselves to, whether the avoidance patterns they recognize in their team are patterns that they recognize in their own leadership, whether the thing that they keep waiting for the right moment to address is something that they're also waiting for the right moment to address inside themselves. That's not a comfortable question. I'm not asking it to make anyone feel bad. I'm asking it because I think it's the question that, when answered with real honesty, tends to generate the most movement. Look inward and directive clarity are connected at the root. The clarity that you bring to your leadership of other people comes from the clarity that you're willing to bring to yourself first. And the avoidance that shows up in the conversation you're not having with your team usually has a counterpart in the conversations that you're not having with yourself. The invitation isn't to have all those conversations today. It's just to stop pretending that the ones that you've been avoiding don't exist, because the pretending costs more than the conversation ever would. Name the conversation. You don't have to have it today, but let yourself see it clearly, because that's where this starts. Not in the having it, in the acknowledging that it's there. We started this video with the idea that there's a conversation that you haven't had, and that the silence around it isn't neutral. That it's been accumulating, taking up space, shaping things in ways that are real even when they're invisible. What I hope you're taking from this is that the weight of the not saying is almost always heavier than the saying itself. And that directness in leadership isn't about delivering blunt truths with maximum efficiency. It's about being clear enough with yourself to be clear with the people around you, and having the conversations that need to happen before the cost of not having them becomes a dominant story. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to give it a like and a subscribe. It helps me, it helps the channel, and it helps people like us find the content that really matters. And as always, I'd love to remind you that you matter too. Don't forget that.